Bring forth the instrument capable of restoring what our craftsmen could not. Bring Morth in day, and I inside hide. No meal did successfully in Locktitch. Which aside!
The white light folded inward so fast it felt like the room had swallowed itself, and I hit polished stone on one knee with a 20-ounce ball-peen hammer clenched in my right hand. For 3 full seconds, nobody said anything. I stayed there, one palm against the floor, waiting for my stomach to remember which direction gravity was supposed to work, while a ring of people in leather aprons and soot-stained work clothes stared at me from beyond a circle of glowing copper symbols. The symbols faded one by one. Somewhere behind me, something enormous groaned like a ship taking on water. Finally, a man near the edge of the circle looked at the hammer in my hand and said, "That's not a legendary hammer." I looked down at it. Steel head, hickory handle, chipped red paint near the grip. Same hammer I'd been holding a moment before everything had gone white. "No," I said. "It cost $38. Nobody seemed to know what a dollar was, which was probably for the best. I pushed myself upright and finally looked around. The building was some kind of public foundry, big enough to fit a small house inside it. Brick furnaces lined one wall. Overhead shafts and leather drive belts disappeared into rafters blackened by decades of smoke. Half-finished festival decorations still hung between support beams, bright ribbons and hammered copper medallions drooping beneath a haze of heat. Through the open doors, I could see a broad stone street crowded with dismantled stalls, wagons loaded with crates, and banners bearing the same stylized hammer and needle crest. Whatever celebration had happened here recently had been enormous. The thing behind me groaned again. I turned. A machine taller than I was occupied the center of the foundry. Twin bellows the size of carriage bodies, a heavy iron flywheel, a system of shafts, cams, linkages, counterweights, and copper tubing feeding air towards several communal forge pits. One side had been opened completely. Plates had been removed. Bolts and wedges covered the floor. 3 different reinforcement straps had been riveted across a thick mounting bracket, and the bracket was still cracked straight through. "You summoned me for that?" I asked. Several people exchanged looks. An older woman standing beside the machine crossed her arms. She was broad through the shoulders without being bulky, with iron gray hair tied behind her head and forearms marked by old burns. Her leather apron had been repaired so many times that I wasn't sure any of the original piece remained. "We summoned the instrument capable of restoring what our craftsmen could not," she said. Her voice had the comfortable roughness of someone accustomed to speaking over hammers. The Grand Maker's Fair pushed Asterfall's public forges beyond anything they were built to endure. The West Forge array failed 3 days ago. We repaired the mounting plate twice, replaced it once. Reinforced it after that. It keeps splitting. I looked from her to the glowing circle beneath my boots. "You tried to summon a tool. A legendary one. And you got me." Her eyes moved to my hammer. "Apparently." A few people looked offended on behalf of the ritual. I looked back at the broken machine. "Can I see it?" The older woman studied me for another second, then stepped aside. "If the summoning brought you here, you may as well justify the expense." I walked toward the mechanism. I didn't know what I expected when I put my hand against the cracked plate. Maybe nothing. Maybe a shock. Instead, my vision sharpened so violently that I jerked my hand back. Fine, pale lines appeared across the metal. Not glowing runes exactly. More like information had been painted onto the world in a way my brain understood before I could question how. Iron alloy, carbon content, inclusion density, heat history, repeated impact loading. The crack itself became a branching map of stress. Then the view widened. The plate wasn't the problem. A crooked line of force ran backward through the mounting assembly, into the bearing housing, through the drive shaft, and toward the flywheel. I touched the plate again. The information settled. True Forge site. Material: medium carbon iron alloy. Structural integrity: 38%. Primary fracture, fatigue propagation from lateral loading. Previous repairs: 3. Repair effectiveness: temporary. Root failure source. Drive shaft misalignment: 4.2 degrees. Secondary source: worn left bearing sleeve. Continued reinforcement of mounting plate will transfer failure into frame rail within approximately 27 operating hours. Recommended correction: realign shaft, replace bearing sleeve, relieve distorted mounting surface, repair fracture only after load path is corrected. Maximum restored performance with available materials. 96% original specification. I stared at it long enough that the older woman said, "Well, you're repairing the wrong fracture." One of the men near the ritual made an irritated sound. "Wait, we can see the fracture." "That's why you keep fixing it." I crouched and pointed through the open housing. "The shaft is running sideways." The older woman's expression changed slightly. "How sideways?" 4 degrees, maybe a little more." 4 degrees would have eaten the bearing." "It did." I pointed toward the left sleeve. "That's what started this." The bearing wore unevenly. The shaft dropped. Every rotation pulls the bracket sideways. You reinforce the bracket, the force goes somewhere else. Keep doing it and you'll crack the frame. Silence. The woman grabbed a pair of heavy gloves, reached into the open mechanism, and put 2 fingers against the exposed sleeve. She twisted it. Even from where I crouched, I could see the movement. Damn. One of the other smiths leaned closer. "We checked that bearing." "You checked whether it turned," she said, "not whether it walked." She looked at me again. "Can you fix it?" I looked toward the forge, then at the scattered tools. None were exactly mine, but a hammer was still a hammer. A file was still a file. Fire still made steel move. Probably. "I've never seen half these alloys before. Your measurements mean nothing to me, and I arrived in your city about 4 minutes ago." She grunted. "Fair, but I know why it broke." That got the faintest hint of a smile. "Then start there." Her name was Rowan. I learned that while we were taking the machine apart because she finally decided that anyone elbow-deep in her forge assembly deserved an introduction. She ran one of Asterfall's independent smithies and had been dragged into the public foundry repair after the city's own crew ran out of ideas. Hesta showed me how their measurement rods were marked. I showed her where the shaft had polished one side of the bearing sleeve almost mirror smooth. True Forge Sight told me things faster than I knew how to process them, but it didn't move my hands. That part was still mine. We blocked the flywheel, removed the retaining collar, drove the bent pin free, and eased the shaft out far enough to expose the sleeve. The original sleeve was bronze mixed with something Forge Sight identified as trace mana reactive tin. I had no idea what mana reactive tin meant, but I understood worn bearing surfaces. Hesta found a replacement blank. We heated it only enough to work the outer diameter because the inner surface needed to stay hard. I filed the seating edge, checked the fit, reheated the distorted mounting plate, and used a straight edge while Hesta adjusted the shaft supports. Every time I touched the metal, Forge Sight showed me the stress changing. Too tight on the left. Better. High load at the lower bolt. Shim the rear support. Better. We worked for nearly 3 hours. Nobody performed magic over my shoulder. Nobody handed me a mythical hammer. Nobody told me the machine had become legendary. We corrected the shaft, replaced the sleeve, flattened the warped mounting surface, heated the cracked bracket until the metal reached a workable orange, beveled the fracture, welded it closed with compatible filler, normalized the repair, and reinforced only the area that actually needed reinforcement. When we finally turned the flywheel by hand, it moved without the sideways shudder I'd noticed before. Hesta watched the bracket. I watched the bearing. One of the city smiths released the bellows drive. The great mechanism came alive with a deep, rolling thump. Leather bellows expanded. Shafts spun. Air roared into the forge pits. The repaired bracket didn't move. Forge Sight flickered across my vision. Structural integrity, 93%. Load distribution, stable. Predicted service life under normal operation, 17 years before scheduled bearing replacement. I exhaled. Hesta looked at the machine, then at me. "Legendary hammer?" someone muttered from behind us. Hesta snorted. Apparently the ritual was more specific than we were. I glanced at the ordinary hammer still hanging from my belt. I'd like to think it has feelings. That was how I became a blacksmith in Asterfall, although the city spent the next day arguing about whether the summoning technically made me a person, an instrument, or a ritual error. I stayed out of the debate by following Hesta back to her workshop. Her smithy sat 2 streets away from the public foundry, squeezed between a wheelwright and a shop selling carved wooden instruments. Asterfall itself was larger than I'd first realized. The Grand Makers Fair had ended only days earlier, and the entire town still looked like it was recovering from being occupied by every craftsman in the kingdom at once. Temporary awnings were coming down. Painted signs leaned against walls, waiting to be collected. Merchants argued over leftover materials. I saw glass that bent without breaking, thread that shimmered silver in shade, blocks of reddish wood stacked beside stone that looked light enough to float. Forge sight reacted whenever I focused on metal and went frustratingly quiet when I looked at everything else. That was my first clue that whatever had happened to me came with limits. Hesta's smithy had 2 forges. The larger one was hers. The smaller back forge had a cracked brick lip, a hand bellows, an old anvil, and enough dents in the workbench to suggest several generations of apprentices had learned bad habits there. "You can sleep upstairs until we decide whether your ritual has an expiration date," Hesta said. "And you can use that forge if you earn your coal." "How do I earn coal?" She pointed toward a wooden crate beside the door. Inside were broken things. Not swords. Not armor. Things. A bent oven hinge. 2 split tool sockets, a snapped pot handle, a badly worn draw knife. A small iron latch with one side twisted nearly flat. "People leave repairs," she said. "Half the apprentices in town hate them. No glory in fixing what somebody else already used." I picked up the oven hinge. True forge sight activated. Wrought iron, repeated thermal cycling, pinhole elongated, hinge leaf distorted from door sag. Primary failure, not hinge material, door alignment incorrect by 9 millimeters. Repair, without correcting mounting position, will fail again. I smiled. "I like repairs." Hesta noticed. "That worries me more than the summoning." My first paying customer arrived before noon. She was an elderly baker who walked with the careful stiffness of someone whose knees had declared independence years ago. The oven door in her shop wouldn't close, and 2 smiths had already told her to replace the hinge assembly. She had brought the broken lower hinge wrapped in cloth and looked embarrassed when she explained that a replacement would cost more than she could manage until after market week. I asked if I could see the oven. Hesta raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The bakery was 6 doors down. The problem was exactly what Forge Sight had predicted. The hinge had worn, but the real issue was the stone base under the oven frame settling unevenly. The door sagged enough that every time it closed, its weight twisted the lower hinge instead of resting through both pins. "Can you fix it?" the baker asked. "The hinge, yes. But if I only fix the hinge, you'll be back in a month." She looked worried. "Is the oven ruined?" "No, it needs a shim under the lower frame, and the hinge remounted 2 finger widths higher." I caught myself. "I mean, not 2 finger widths. Less than that." She laughed. "I understood you the first time." Back at Hesta's forge, I heated the hinge leaf, flattened the distortion, punched the elongated hole clean, fitted a new pin sleeve, and forged a slightly thicker replacement pin. Forge Sight kept feeding me temperature ranges and stress response, but it still couldn't make the metal behave if I struck badly. My first blow landed slightly off-center. The system didn't save me, I had to correct it. That made me trust the ability more. It was information, not a puppet string. I normalized the iron, let it cool slowly, then returned to the bakery with a thin steel shim plate I'd made from scrap. We leveled the frame, repositioned the hinge, and hung the door. It closed with one smooth, heavy swing. The baker opened it, closed it, opened it again. "How much?" she asked. I had no idea. "What did the other smiths quote?" 8 silver for the replacement hinge. More if the frame needed work. 2, her head snapped up. 2 silver? The metal was scrap. It took an hour. Hesta, who had apparently followed us just to witness me make bad financial decisions, leaned against the doorway. 3, she said. I looked at her. "Coal costs money." The baker paid 3 silver and left smiling. Hesta waited until she was gone. "You charge less than replacement because you repaired instead of replaced." "Fine. You charge nothing for your time, and I'll throw you into the river." "Noted. You were going to say 2. I'm learning. Learn faster." The next repair was a logging axe. A woman brought it in with the head wrapped in old cloth and apologized 3 times before setting it on the bench. Her husband used it in the timber yards outside town. A crack had opened from the eye toward the cheek, and another smith had told them the head was finished. Forge site disagreed. Steel edge welded onto softer iron body. Approximate age, 39 years. Stress fracture caused by loose handle allowing repeated lateral impact. Hardened edge intact. Repair viable. Replacement head cost relative to repair, 2.6 times higher. I turned it in my hands. Did somebody make this for him? His father, she said. That's why he keeps pretending it isn't broken. It is broken. Her face fell. But it isn't dead. I removed the handle rather than trying to work around it. The crack had collected rust deep inside, so I opened it carefully, cleaned it, heated the iron body while protecting the hardened edge from unnecessary temperature, and forge welded the split with a softer, compatible strip. Hesta watched without hovering. Water? She asked when I was ready to treat the repaired section. Oil, I said. Why? The eye already failed from stress. Water is faster than I want. I'd rather sacrifice a little hardness in the body than create another crack. Hesta nodded once. I quenched the repaired section in oil, tempered it, dressed the eye, fitted a new hickory-like handle from Hesta's stock, and wedged it properly. Then I sharpened the original edge instead of grinding half of it away. Forge site showed the final result. Structural integrity, 88%. Balance improved, 6%. Estimated safe service life under normal use, 11 years before handle replacement. The woman stared at the axe when I handed it back. That's the same head? Most of it. How much? Hesta looked at me. I looked at Hesta. 6 silver? Hesta nodded. I was absurdly pleased with myself. The woman paid, hugged the axe to her chest like I'd repaired a family member, and left. Hesta waited a moment. You like saving things. Is that bad for a blacksmith? Depends whether you want to be rich. Do I need to be? She laughed hard enough that someone in the wheelwright's shop next door shouted through the wall asking what was funny. Over the next 2 weeks, the crate beside Hesta's door stopped being a crate and became a queue. I repaired a well-chained swivel worn almost through at the bearing surface. I forged a new pin for a butcher's cleaver handle because the blade itself had decades left in it. I rebuilt the iron throat of a hand pump whose owner had been told the entire pump needed replacing. I made 6 replacement rivets for a carpenter who kept trying to pay me in apples until Hesta finally accepted the apples as partial shop tax. A stable worker brought in 3 horseshoes, twisted by rocky roads. A cooper brought a hooping hammer with a mushroomed face. A kitchen worker arrived carrying a cooking pot with one handle hanging by a single rivet and admitted that the pot belonged to the inn, but she would be charged for a new one if it failed during her shift. I replaced both rivets, reinforced the handle lug, checked the opposite side, found a hairline crack beginning there too, and repaired that one before it failed. She tried to give me everything in her purse. I took 2 copper. That isn't enough, she said. Then tell people where the shop is. Hesta was behind me. I could feel the disappointment radiating through the room. 3 copper, she said. The woman added 1 more and left. I'm improving, I told Hesta. At this pace, you'll understand commerce before you die of old age. The work taught me more than the summoning had. True Forge site became easier to control. At first, touching any tool gave me a flood of information, much of it useless. Trace composition, manufacture age, heat cycles, microscopic wear. By the end of the 2nd week, I could focus. Show me the failure. Show me the repair. Show me what matters. It also became clear that the ability did not know everything. If I picked up a familiar iron nail, the information was precise. If Hesta handed me a piece of blue-gray metal called frosterone, Forge site could identify hardness, grain structure, thermal behavior, and internal stress. But parts of the description remained blank until I worked it. Unknown magical response. Enchantment compatibility. Insufficient experience. Recommended working range. Provisional. I loved that. It meant the world could still surprise me. Hesta loved it less when I used half a morning experimentally heating scraps of frosterone to see how it changed. You are paying for that? I know. With actual money. I know. Not repaired spoons. 1 spoon. Actual money, Eric. My name had started traveling through Asterfall. Not far. I wasn't famous. I was simply the foreign smith at Rowan's workshop who would repair things other people told you to replace. That reputation brought me stranger work. A gardener from one of the wealthy houses brought shears with an expensive silver inlay and assumed I would stop everything for him. I told him I could look at them after the farmer waiting beside him. The gardener glanced at the farmer's cracked plowshare and then at me. These belong to house. They'll still belong to the house in an hour. Hesta coughed into her fist to hide a laugh. The farmer tried to let the gardener go first. I didn't. The plowshare had split along an old weld, and planting weather wouldn't wait for somebody's decorative hedges. I repaired the plow first. The gardener stayed, partly offended and partly fascinated. When his turn came, I fixed the shears too. He paid without complaint. A few days later, someone from the same estate sent a polished sword in for edgework. I sent it back because the blade didn't need sharpening. The owner had been using the wrong angle against the whetstone and had rolled the edge. I included a note explaining how to maintain it. Hesta stared at the returned payment pouch. You could have charged him. For what? Telling him he was doing it wrong. That feels mean. Advice is a product. I'm starting to understand why everyone thinks blacksmiths are grumpy. We spend all day explaining obvious things to people holding sharp objects. The first time I saw the cloak, I almost missed it. A woman entered the shop carrying a road pack, rolled maps, and a gray-green Raincloak that looked too light for the weather outside. Asterfall had been taking intermittent afternoon rain since the fair ended. Everybody came into the smithy dripping. She didn't. Water sat in round beads across the fabric, gathered along the hem, and rolled away whenever she moved. She placed a small metal clasp on the counter. One side had snapped where a thin, curved arm connected to the base. Can you repair that without ruining the finish? She asked. Probably. That answer inspires confidence. I've learned to stop saying yes before I touch things. That made her smile. I own a Kest. Eric. I picked up the clasp. True Forge sight activated. Silver bronze alloy. High flexibility. Failure caused by repeated asymmetric loading. Material fatigue concentrated at attachment arm. Underlying load source, non-metallic textile exhibiting unusually high tensile retention under wet conditions. Textile classification unavailable. I looked at the cloak. Forge sight went blank over the cloth. What is this made from? Mist moth silk? The name meant nothing to me. It doesn't absorb water? Not much. She ran 2 fingers over the gray-green fabric. The droplets slipped away. A tailor from Bellhaven made this kind of thing famous at the Grand Makers Fair. Half the road crews bought whatever imitations they could afford before leaving Asterfall. This one is real. Hesta looked over from her anvil. You were at the fair? Working. Iona unrolled one of her maps enough to show a web of roads through hills and forest. Survey office hired extra hands after the traffic wrecked half the temporary routes. I examined the clasp again. The clasp failed because the cloth doesn't stretch the way whoever fitted this expected. Iona blinked. You can tell that from the clasp? The metal kept taking the load in the same direction. If I remake the same arm, it'll snap again. I forged a replacement arm slightly broader at the root, changed the curve so load traveled into the base instead of the thinnest section, and added a rotating connection rather than a rigid one. It wasn't flashy. It was barely visible once installed. Iona put the cloak back on, pulled the front closed, and twisted her shoulders as if testing it against wind. The clasp moved instead of fighting the fabric. That's better than the original. The original probably wasn't designed for this material. It was. She looked amused. Just not by the tailor who made the cloak. That caught my attention. The tailor only made the cloth part? The garment, not the cheap clasp somebody added later. She tapped it. There was a whole argument about it at the fair. Craftsmen blaming other craftsmen because none of them understood what the others were making. Hesta grunted. That sounds like a craft fair. Iona paid, then lingered while I put away the tools. If you're interested in materials you don't understand, Bellhaven might be worth visiting. Because of one tailor? Because Bellhaven has become strange. She said it with complete seriousness. The tailor was enough. Then merchants started talking about an apothecary whose medicines were upsetting half the usual price structure. Adventurers reroute through town. Material dealers are opening new stalls. People who make unusual things keep finding reasons to stop there. Hesta glanced at me. I pretended not to notice. How far? I asked. Iona pointed at the map. From Asterfall? Depends on the road. Green Road is the practical route if weather behaves. It runs through farming villages, timber country, a few caravan stations, then bends east toward Bellhaven. You're going there? Eventually. I have survey work on Green Road first. She rolled the map closed. You'd probably spend the entire trip repairing wagons. That sounds fine. She laughed as if I was joking. I wasn't. After she left, Hesta hammered in silence for almost a minute. No, she finally said. I didn't ask anything. You were about to. I was thinking. Loudly, I picked up a damaged stove latch from the queue. Bellhaven sounds interesting. Asterfall is interesting. I know. You have work here. I know. People trust you. I know. Hesta set her hammer down. Then why do you have the expression apprentices get before doing something inconvenient? I touched the latch. Forge sight identified a badly cut spring notch. Because I don't know what mist moth silk is. You're a blacksmith. Exactly. She stared at me. I continued. I don't know what frost iron actually does under magic. I don't know why some alloys here carry mana and others don't. I don't understand the fasteners on half the equipment that came through the fair. I fixed the foundry because a shaft was crooked. I can do that anywhere. But if I stay here forever, I'm only going to learn what comes through your door. A lot comes through my door. Then I'll come back with better questions. Hesta looked offended by how difficult that was to argue with. I didn't leave immediately. That would have felt wrong. I spent another week finishing everything I had promised. The farmer collected his plowshare. The baker came back with a tray of rolls because her oven door still closed perfectly. The woman with the logging axe returned carrying the old broken handle because her husband wanted me to turn part of it into a wedge for his tool chest rather than throw it away. I did. Hesta made me charge for it. I also built myself a travel kit. That might have been the most satisfying thing I made in Asterfall because every piece had a reason. One medium cross-peen hammer instead of 3 specialized ones. Tongs that could handle several stock sizes. Flat file, half-round file. Cold chisel. Punch. Compact hacksaw frame. Sharpening stone. Calipers. Hesta taught me to read in local measures. A small hand drill, rivet set, wire brush, folding square, awl, and a leather roll for smaller tools. For roadside heat, I couldn't carry a forge, so Hesta showed me a compact, double-chamber hand bellows used by farriers and caravan smiths. I modified the nozzle to fit a simple clay trench hearth that could be built almost anywhere. True Forge Sight helped me reduce weight without making the frame flimsy. When I finished, Hesta picked up the packed roll and frowned. Too heavy. I removed 4 tools. Still too heavy. I need the hammer. I meant the spare stock. She opened the side pouch. You are carrying 6 pounds of steel like the road has never heard of metal. What if someone needs a repair? Then you buy metal. What if there isn't any? Then you scavenge it. I looked at the pouch. She sighed. 3 pounds. 4. 3. 3.5. You negotiate better over scrap than labor. I'm learning. On my last evening, Hesta closed the shop early. We sat outside beneath the overhang while rain tapped against the street stones and smoke from a dozen Asterfall chimneys drifted low over the roofs. Most of the fair banners had finally disappeared. The town was becoming itself again. Hesta handed me a small iron token stamped with Rowan's hammer mark. Any smith worth dealing with will recognize that you worked under my roof. I wasn't your apprentice. No, apprentices listen. I listen sometimes. You argued with my coal prices. Your coal prices are criminal. See? I turned the token over. Why give it to me? Because somebody will eventually ask who taught the summoned lunatic not to quench everything in water. I already knew that. Then tell them I taught you humility. That would be fraud. Hesta smiled. Then her expression softened. Eric, there's one thing your sight won't tell you. What? When something should be left broken. I looked at her. You repair everything that reaches your hands because you can see a way. That's useful. It's also dangerous. People will bring you weapons, locks, war machines, things built to hurt people. Eventually, somebody with money will ask you to make something better, and the fact that you can doesn't mean you should. I thought about the ritual. Asterfall had asked for an instrument capable of restoring what craftsmen couldn't. Somehow, it had reached across worlds and found me. Then I'll decide case by case. Good. What would you do? Charge them first. I laughed. There she is. At dawn, I stood at the western road gate with my tool roll across my back, the travel bellows strapped beside it, a small pouch of coins at my belt, and the same cheap earth hammer tucked where I could reach it. Asterfall woke behind me to furnace smoke and market bells. Ahead, green road stretched between wet fields and low hills, disappearing toward a line of distant forest. Iona had left 2 days earlier with the survey caravan. If I kept a reasonable pace, I might catch them before the first major station. Hesta had told me not to hurry. Roads had a way of deciding how quickly you traveled. I took one last look back at the city that had tried to summon a legendary tool and gotten a repairman instead. I still didn't know why the ritual had chosen me. Maybe it had misunderstood the request. Maybe it understood it better than anyone who cast it. Either way, Asterfall's forge was running, its broken tools were working again, and somewhere beyond the hills was a town full of craftsmen, making things I didn't understand yet. That was enough reason to walk. I tightened the strap across my shoulder, adjusted the hammer at my belt, and stepped onto Green Road. By noon, Green Road had already taught me that Hesta had been right about roads deciding how quickly you traveled. On a map, the route leaving Asterfall looked simple. One broad line through farms, low hills, timber country, river crossings, and caravan stations before eventually bending east toward Bellhaven. On foot, it was mud, loose stone, wheel ruts deep enough to swallow a boot, hills that looked much smaller from a distance, and an endless collection of things that had broken because somebody had assumed they would survive one more season. I stopped twice before the first sunset. The first time was for a farmer trying to hold the mounting bracket of a seed drill together with cord. The second was for a kettle handle at the farmhouse where they let me sleep in the hayloft. Neither repair was important. That was exactly why I did them. True Forge sight could tell me that the seed drill's mounting holes had been punched too close together, concentrating the entire pulling force into a narrow strip of iron, but it did not straighten the bracket for me. I still had to build the fire, heat the metal, flatten it, punch better holes, and reshape it around the wooden frame. The farmer offered me half a loaf of bread and 1 copper coin. I took both because I could practically hear Hesta threatening to walk all the way down Green Road just to teach me what money was for. By the next morning, Asterfall's chimney smoke had disappeared behind the hills, and my shoulders had begun negotiating independently with the straps of my tool roll. Hesta had also been right about the spare steel. 3.5 pounds had felt conservative when it was sitting on a workbench. On my back, it felt like a personal insult. I was considering whether pride counted as a usable construction material when I heard shouting around the next bend. Not frightened shouting, irritated shouting, expensive shouting. I rounded the bend and found 3 merchant wagons stopped across Green Road. 2 had been pulled onto the grass. The third leaned badly toward the ditch with one rear wheel crooked underneath it. Crates and sacks had been unloaded around the roadside. 2 men were arguing beside the axle while another tried to lever the wagon higher with a timber post. A familiar gray-green cloak stood a little apart from them, perfectly dry despite the drizzle. Iona Kest saw me before I recognized her beneath the hood. I was starting to think Asterfall convinced you to stay. I was starting to think you were 2 days ahead of me. She pointed at the wagon. We had help. The man beside the axle turned. He was somewhere in his 40s, heavy through the chest, wearing a durable merchant's coat, and the permanently suspicious expression of someone who made a living wondering what things should cost. "You know him?" he asked. "He repaired my cloak clasp. I need a wheelwright." He repaired it better than the original. The man's eyes traveled over my tools, the portable bellows, the earth hammer hanging at my belt, and finally the damaged wheel. "Blacksmith?" "Usually." "That is not an answer I like. Neither is the wheel is ruined, but somebody already gave you that one." Iona looked away to hide a smile. The man stared at me another second. "Bren Talwick, these are my wagons, hub split, axle pin sheared. Nearest proper wheelwright is back toward Asterfall. If I send someone, I'm delayed 3 days." I crouched beside the wheel. "And if you drag it to the next station?" "I lose the wagon. Probably the axle, too. Can you fix it?" "Let me find out." I put one hand against the iron tire. True Forge sight opened. Wrought iron tire, multiple reheating cycles. Current hoop tension excessive. Diameter mismatch following previous refitting. I moved to the axle pin. Low carbon iron. Progressive wear. Final shear fracture. Bearing contact uneven. Then I touched the iron bands around the wooden hub. The power could not directly read the wood, but the metal surrounding it told the story anyway. Uneven compression. Repeated lateral loading. Internal movement where there should have been none. Inferred primary failure. Wheel tire refitted, undersized, compressing hub. Secondary failure, bearing clearance insufficient. Axle pin subjected to progressive side loading. Recommended correction. Relieve hoop tension. Stabilize wooden hub, replace axle pin, correct bearing fit, rebalance wheel assembly. "The split hub isn't what started this," I said. Bren stared at the very visibly split hub. "I'm looking at it. Somebody reset this tire too tight." One of his workers shook his head. "Iron tires are supposed to be tight." "Yes, not tight enough to crush the wheel." I pointed toward the damaged bearing. Then this started binding. Every rotation loaded the same side of the hub. Your axle pin has probably been shaving itself for weeks. Bren crouched beside me. "Can you save it?" "The wood needs clamping. I'm not a wheelwright, so I'm not pretending I can make the hub new. But I can stabilize it, fix the ironwork, and get you safely to someone who can replace the hub later." "What do you need?" "Unload the rear of the wagon completely. 2 jacks if you have them. Hardwood wedges, iron strap we can sacrifice. Charcoal, oil, and tell him to stop levering against the axle before he turns a repairable problem into firewood." The worker slowly lowered his timber post. Bren looked at me on how long. "I don't know yet. That answer is getting worse. Would you prefer a confident lie?" He considered it. "Not today." For the next several hours, the roadside became a forge. They unloaded the wagon until the rear frame could be raised without trying to crush us. Iona helped me measure the wheel while Bren's workers cleaned dirt away from the hub. The split followed the grain between 2 spokes. We worked adhesive into it, drove fitted hardwood keys into the opened section, then clamped the hub with rope and wedges while I removed the damaged iron band. One hub ring was still sound. The other had stretched enough that Forge Sight marked it as unreliable. I sacrificed a flat iron brace from an empty crate frame, heated it in a shallow trench forge, scarfed the ends, and forge welded a new ring. My travel bellows felt ridiculous after Hesta's shop, but ridiculous was better than useless. Iona took the second handle and began pumping. "You've done this before?" I asked. "I've held equipment for craftsmen who spent the entire time explaining why I was doing it wrong." "That qualifies. Then I expect apprentice wages." "Bren has money." "I heard that," Bren called from beneath the wagon. I forged the replacement axle pin from part of the steel Hesta had made me carry, upsetting one end for the head, drawing the shank to fit, and filing the bearing surface until Forge Sight showed even contact. The tire took longer. We removed it from the wheel and heated it gradually enough to correct the distorted section without making it smaller again. By the time the drizzle became steady rain, the tire was ready. We set it hot around the repaired wheel, centered it with quick hammer taps, and cooled it evenly. Steam rolled across Green Road. The iron tightened. The hub stayed closed. I ran my hand over the metal again. Binding eliminated. Axle pin contact even. Hoop compression within acceptable range. Hub repair provisional. I made Bren rotate the wheel by hand before we lowered the wagon. Then I loaded only a quarter of the cargo. Walk it 50 paces. Bren frowned. You repaired it. Yes. Do you trust your repair? Enough to test it before putting 3 tons on top of it. That, apparently, was the answer he wanted. The wagon moved 50 paces, no wobble. We loaded half the cargo, tested again, then everything. The repaired wheel remained straight. Bren stood in the rain watching it turn. How long will it last? My work? Years. The hub itself needs a wheelwright when you reach one. Don't let anyone shrink that tire smaller. If the split opens again, replace the wooden hub instead of pretending another iron band can solve it. How much? I looked at the steel I'd used, the charcoal we'd burned, and the dinner I could smell cooking beneath the first wagon's awning. A ride toward Bellhaven. Food while I'm with you. Replacement charcoal at the next station. Bren's face looked genuinely offended. That repair kept a loaded trade wagon moving. Yes. And you want dinner. Good dinner. Do you know what commerce is? Hesta asked me that several times. Who is Hesta? A blacksmith with strong opinions about my pricing. I already respect her. He held out his hand. Ride, meals, charcoal, and 4 silver. 4? Do not negotiate downward. That's not what negotiation means. For you it is. I shook his hand. That was how I joined Bren Talwick's caravan. Nobody swore an oath. There was no dramatic promise to travel together forever. He had wagons. I had made one of them move again, and Bellhaven was in the same direction. Iona rode mostly in the second wagon with maps spread across a folding board. She was surveying Green Road for drainage failures, damaged markers, washed embankments, bridge wear, and places where the traffic from Asterfall's recent Maker's Fair had widened or damaged the original route. Bren carried normal things: cloth, preserved food, tools, lamp oil, household goods, and crates belonging to merchants who expected their property to arrive when promised. I learned quickly that he understood travel as a sequence of delays separated by brief moments of progress. I also learned that I was about to create many more delays. The first happened the following morning. We were passing farmland when I saw a man and his daughter beside a plow. The plowshare sat on a stump. The farmer was hammering a crack closed while the metal was cold. I turned on the wagon bench. Bren did not look at me. No. I haven't said anything. Your face said it. He's ruining that share. 47 crates have delivery dates. 20 minutes? Your last 20-minute repair took until sunset. That was a wheel. Everything becomes a wheel when you touch it. Iona leaned out of the second wagon. I need to check their farm track. One of my road markers is missing. Bren looked betrayed. You're supposed to stop him. I'm a surveyor. Stopping beside roads is most of my profession. We pulled over. The farmer immediately apologized when I approached. I know it should go to a smith. Planting's already late. I just need it to hold. I picked up the share. Forge site mapped a bad weld running between the harder steel cutting edge and softer iron body. The original joint had never fully bonded along the lower third. Years of bending had slowly widened the internal void until the edge began separating. Hammering it shut won't fix this. Can anything? Most of the tool is fine. I opened the failed section rather than hiding it, cleaned the surfaces to bright metal, scarfed the joint, heated both parts in the farmer's charcoal fire, added flux, and Forge welded the seam from the center outward so scale had somewhere to escape. Forge sight showed the internal line disappearing beneath each controlled heat. I normalized the body slowly enough that I did not ruin the harder cutting edge, then restored the final bevel. The farmer turned it over in his hands. My father bought this when I was a boy. Then stop hitting it cold. I was desperate. Be desperate with a fire. He laughed. I charged 1 silver because Bren was standing behind me with his arms crossed like the physical embodiment of accounting. The farmer paid. His daughter brought us apples and 2 rounds of cheese. Bren accepted them before I could say anything. About an hour later, the farmer caught up on horseback and warned us that the lower road ahead had washed out during the previous night's rain. Iona checked her map, found an older ridge route, and diverted the caravan before Bren's wagons buried themselves to the axles. Bren drove in silence for a while. "The cheese isn't the point," I said. "I know. Neither is the warning. I know. Helping people has value that doesn't always—" "Eric?" "Yes?" "If you explain economics to me again, I will begin charging rent for the wagon seat." I stopped. 5 minutes later, he handed me an apple without looking at me. The next repair belonged to him. I heard it beneath the wagon every time he touched the brake lever. A faint metallic click, followed by a second softer one. "Stop." "What now?" "Brake linkage. The brakes work." He pulled the lever. Something snapped. The wagon stopped. Bren stared downward. "That sounded expensive." "Less expensive than hearing it halfway down a hill?" The linkage pin had worn almost halfway through before shearing. Worse, the iron clevis around it had elongated holes from months of running dry. "When did you last grease this?" "Recently." "Define recently." "Winter." "Which winter?" Iona started laughing. Bren climbed down. "I transport goods. I do not romance the underside of my wagons. Your wagon would appreciate flowers occasionally." Instead of simply making a replacement pin the same size, I bored the damaged holes round again, fitted replaceable bronze sleeves, forged a slightly larger pin, and added a narrow grease channel that could be reached from outside the frame. Now you can lubricate it without crawling underneath. Bren examined the small opening. "How often?" "Every month in wet weather." "Every season?" "Month?" "2 months." "This is not negotiable." "That's what people who are bad at commerce say." I charged him 1 apple. Green road changed around us. Farmland gave way to taller trees and timber clearings. The route narrowed through fern-covered banks, then opened near loading stations where cut logs waited beside sheds and draft animals rested beneath long roofs. At one station, a teamster brought me a bent suspension plate from a heavy freight wagon. The metal was dark blue-gray with pale streaks running through it. Trueforge site recognized iron and carbon, then stalled on the rest. Unknown trace component. Thermal behavior partially unknown. Elastic recovery unusually high. Mana response dormant. "What is this?" I asked. "Blueback spring iron." "Why?" He flipped the plate over. The underside was almost navy. "Blue on the back." I stared at him. "I walked into that. I bought a broken scrap from him and spent the evening experimenting beside Bren's camp. Too much heat destroyed the springiness. Too little barely moved it. I cut 3 small samples. 1 went into water, 1 into oil, and 1 cooled in air. Forge site learned with me. Water quench, fracture risk high. Oil quench, acceptable. Air hardening, partial. Trace component response identified. I flexed the best sample between pliers and watched it return to shape. Iona looked over from the fire. "You're smiling at garbage again." It stopped being unknown. Most people enjoy mystery. Mysteries are repairs without enough information. That may be the most blacksmith thing you've said. Her travel case was open beside her. When she scraped 1 knuckle closing a map tube, she reached inside and pulled out a potion bottle. My attention went to the bottle before the injury. Palm-sized. Cylindrical clear glass. Rounded shoulders. Narrow short neck. Thick transparent base. Smooth silver metal stopper. Inside was transparent ruby red liquid. It looked absurdly clean beside everything else in camp. "Healing potion?" "Yes." "Asterfall?" "Bellhaven." She drank a small amount. The scrape across her knuckle faded visibly within moments. "That's normal?" I asked. "The healing?" "Mostly. The price and consistency?" "Apparently not." She resealed it. Merchants have been complaining about Bellhaven's potion market for months. One apothecary can supply amounts people don't think should be possible. "The one you mentioned before?" "Probably. There are stories. A woman who couldn't walk properly was restored. A governor became involved. Some people claim nobles are traveling there for medicine now. Do you believe all of that? No. She held up her healed hand. But I believe this. I looked at her rainproof cloak and the red potion in her kit. Two completely unrelated crafts, both somehow pointing me toward the same town. Bellhaven really is strange. I did warn you. They have blacksmiths, right? Many. Good. You sound relieved. I'd be offended if the famous crafting town had somehow forgotten metal. Our third day together ended at a small roadside settlement whose smith was away with a timber crew. Bren intended to stop only long enough to water the horses. Then someone saw the tools on my pack. An hour later, I had a workbench beneath the inn's side awning and a line, a cracked horseshoe, a carpenter's chisel ruined by overheating, a butcher's cleaver sharpened so aggressively that the blade was thinning behind the edge, a leaking pot, a wagon latch, shears, a shovel split around its socket. Every repair was different, and that was exactly why I liked them. Forge Sight was useful because it stopped me from assuming all broken iron wanted the same answer. The sun disappeared. The line did not. Bren stood in the inn doorway. This is a disease. You said we were staying the night. I assumed sleeping was involved. Tomorrow. Near the end of the line, a woman holding an old hoe began to leave. I saw the iron head and called her back. I don't need anything fancy, she said. It belonged to my husband's father. My son says I should replace it. The hoe was old enough that the iron had gone nearly black in places. The cutting edge had been sharpened down until almost nothing remained. I touched it. Forge Sight opened. Wrought iron body. Approximate age, 52 years. Original hardened cutting strip largely consumed through the normal wear. Socket integrity good. 7 historical repairs. Recommended action: retain original body, remove exhausted cutting strip, forge weld replacement high carbon edge, normalize body, selectively harden new edge. Maximum restored function, 91%. Most of it is fine. Really? The part that touches dirt is used up. That's what it was supposed to do. I heated only the working end and cut away the remains of the old steel strip. I shaped a new high carbon edge, gave the joint a long scarf so digging force would spread through several inches instead of ending at one hard line, fluxed both surfaces, and forge welded the new steel into the old iron. Light blows first, then heavier ones once the seam consolidated. The woman watched the entire time. Will it still be his hoe? She asked. I stopped hammering. Was it still his hoe after the first handle broke? Of course. Then yes. I hardened only the new cutting edge, tempered it enough to survive stones, and reused the old handle after cutting away the damaged end. When I handed it back, the tool still looked old. Every pit remained, every earlier hammer mark remained. I'd replaced only the part that had actually reached the end of its life. She counted out 1 silver and a pile of copper. It was short of the 2 silver I had quoted. That's enough. It isn't. You waited until midnight. That's not your fault. My son can bring the rest. Then charge him extra the next time he breaks something. She laughed and left with the hoe over her shoulder. Iona sat on the edge of the bench after the final customer had gone. You know what she'll remember? That I stayed up too late? That you left all the old hammer marks. They weren't hurting anything. Exactly. The repair isn't supposed to erase the thing. She looked at me for a moment. You should remember you said that. Bren called from the doorway. You are no longer bad at commerce. You are actively hostile to it. I slept until almost noon. Bren let me, which was the first sign he had stopped treating my repairs like random interruptions. The second came when we passed a roadside well whose crank had seized. He stopped the wagon before I said anything. 40 minutes. You stopped. 40. An hour. You haven't even looked. Then why set a limit? Because I know you. The crankshaft had corroded inside its bearing collar. Years of pouring grease onto dirty metal had turned rust and grit into grinding paste. The handle had bent because everyone simply pulled harder as the shaft seized. I removed the drum, drove out the shaft, cleaned the bearing, straightened the handle hot, and made 2 thin bronze bushings so the next wear would happen on replaceable surfaces. I added grease grooves and showed the residents how to clean the collar before lubricating it. 52 minutes. Bren said nothing. As we drove away, a boy ran after us carrying fresh eggs. Bren took them. Non-financial value, I said. Speak again and I throw them. He did not. That night, he cooked them. As days passed, people began hearing about me before I arrived. Not my name at first. The repair smith with the strange hammer. The Asterfall man who fixed things other smiths said to replace. The blacksmith traveling with Talwick's caravan. A cooper brought me an iron hoop that kept slipping off a water barrel. The hoop was fine. The barrel had dried unevenly near a stove. I told him to soak and reset the wooden staves before anyone shrank the iron smaller. A mill worker showed me a bearing cap that had cracked twice. The cap was overbuilt. I asked whether the shaft it supported vibrated more than it used to. He thought about it and said yes. I told him to check the shaft alignment before buying a third cap. A teamster asked me to strengthen every bolt on his wagon. Why? I asked. So nothing breaks. Then something more expensive breaks. Stronger is better. Only if the rest of the machine agrees. Bren nodded solemnly beside him like a man who had always understood preventative maintenance. Iona caught me looking. He's learning. Terrifying. Both of you are becoming unbearable. The storm announced itself before we saw it. Warm air turned cold. Wind changed direction. Heavy gray clouds built over the western ridge, and Iona began checking every drainage ditch we passed. Bren increased our pace. There's a major river crossing ahead. Proper road station on the far side. We reach it before dark. We have shelter. About an hour later, we met two road workers walking west with a broken iron bracket balanced on a pole between them. It was a heavy plate with 4 bolt holes and a diagonal fracture through one corner. Bridge? I asked. East approach. What happened? Snapped again. Again? Third time this season. Bren groaned softly. Don't. I put my hand on the bracket. Forge site opened. Structural wrought iron. 2 previous repairs. Failure. Bending fatigue under cyclic overload. Designed load exceeded by approximately 240%. Root load source external to component. Replacement without load correction. Repeated failure predicted. Where does this connect? Tension rod to the approach anchor. Did the road settle? The worker looked at Iona. Spring flood took part of the bank. Her map was already open. How far to the bridge? 6 miles. Supervisor says they're fitting a thicker plate, the worker added. I handed the broken one back. A thicker plate will just make something more expensive fail. Bren sighed. There it is. Thunder rolled behind us. The road worker glanced toward the clouds. They're closing the bridge if the river rises. Good. Good? If this plate was carrying more than twice its intended load, nobody should be driving over it. Bren looked at me. Every sentence you say makes my deliveries later. And your wagon's less crushed. I understand. I resent understanding. Rain started before we reached the river and became a downpour by the time the bridge appeared. It was larger than I expected, a timber road deck resting across 3 stone piers with long iron tie rods beneath the approach spans and heavy anchor assemblies built into the abutments. The rods did not hold the bridge up. They kept the long timber approach frames from spreading and twisting under loaded wagons. The eastern end sagged slightly toward the river. Brown water rushed below, carrying branches against the piers. Wagons waited on both banks behind a timber barrier. Under the eastern approach, workers were already trying to bolt in the thicker replacement plate. Stop! I shouted. They didn't. I slid from Bren's wagon and went down the muddy bank. Do not bolt that in! The supervisor turned with the expression of a man who had been rained on for hours and had run out of patience before breakfast. Who are you? A blacksmith. Then you know plates require bolts. I know that plate is going to fail. It's twice as thick. That's why I'm worried. He looked toward Bren. Bren raised both hands. I no longer control him. Iona came down behind me beneath the mist moth cloak. We examined the failed plate west of here. The deformation isn't simple tension. Her survey badge got the supervisor's attention. He finally gave me 5 minutes. I crawled beneath the approach and touched the first iron tie rod. Forge sight opened. Tensile load elevated. Bending load present. I touched the second. Moderate. The third was almost unloaded. That was immediately wrong. 3 rods meant to share the structure were carrying wildly different forces. I followed the overloaded rod to its anchor shoe. One side of the shoe had polished the stone beneath it while the other barely touched. Angular displacement, 2.9 degrees, load concentration severe. I backed out. I need the first pier. River is too high, the supervisor said. Iona opened an older survey plan. Inspection ledge on the north side. Covered when we widen the deck. Covered isn't removed. 10 minutes later, 2 deck boards had been lifted and Bren tied a rope around my waist because apparently drowning violated our agreement. I lowered myself far enough to reach the bearing shoe where the timber frame met the first stone pier. The instant I touched it, forge sight flooded my vision. Bolts, rods, plates, collars, shoes, connected assembly, multiple interacting load paths. For a second, it was too much information. I closed my eyes and forced the ability down to one question. Show me why the rods are uneven. The noise narrowed. The north-bearing shoe on the first pier had shifted downstream by less than 2 centimeters. The pier itself was fine. The shoe had moved on its stone seat. That tiny change pulled the timber frame slightly out of square with the abutment. One tension rod had been dragged diagonally until it carried most of the lateral load. Another went almost slack. Every heavy wagon twisted the approach, loading and unloading the same bracket thousands of times until the cheap piece finally cracked. They had been repairing the fuse. I climbed back onto the deck and drew the geometry in the mud. Your pier didn't shift. This bearing shoe did. The entire approach is slightly crooked now. The supervisor crouched beside the drawing. Can we put it back? Properly? Yes. Tonight? No, you need to unload this section, jack the frame, remove the shoe, level the stone seat, inspect the timber, reset everything, and probably replace 2 anchor bolts. Then the bridge stays closed. I looked down Green Road. Grain wagons, supply carts, families under tarps, livestock, goods waiting in the storm. Maybe not. The other 2 rods have unused capacity. If I make an equalizing yoke at the abutment, we can transfer part of the overloaded rod's force into the other 2. Then we jack the approach only enough to remove some twist from the frame. It isn't the permanent repair. It's a controlled temporary repair that lets one reduced weight wagon cross at a time until you reset the bearing shoe. You can build that here? I looked toward the maintenance shed. What iron stock do you have? 4 structural bars, 2 spare collars, several discarded anchor plates, enough coal, and a heavy repair forge. Barely enough. The supervisor gave me 1 attempt. If I weakened anything, the bridge remained closed. Fair. Iona became my measurements. Bren became logistics because ordering 20 strangers around was apparently the moment he had been preparing for his entire life. Road workers built cribbing beneath the eastern approach. We positioned 2 screw jacks under separate beams so no single timber took the whole lifting force. I touched both jacks first. Forge sight found a hairline crack in 1 screw collar. We rejected it. The supervisor stopped questioning why I touched everything after that. We lifted the approach less than a finger width. The overloaded rod relaxed enough that the sound changed when I tapped it with my hammer. At the maintenance forge, I began designing the equalizer. A single rigid plate would only relocate the failure, so I needed a broad forked yoke allowing the 3 rod ends to pivot slightly while sharing force. I laid pieces of chalk against the anvil and sketched possibilities. True Forge Sight did not design anything for me. It did something better. I imagined a shape, then it showed where that shape would fail. The first design concentrated stress around the center hole. I widened the fork angle, the second bent too sharply around the outer collars. I thickened the shoulders and rounded the transitions. The third configuration settled into something different. Stress distribution acceptable. Material sufficient. Masterwork potential. High if forged within thermal and alignment tolerances. I smiled. Iona noticed. What? It likes this one. Who? The part of my head that hates bad metal. I regret asking. Forging structural bar that thick was not something a magic ability could make fast. We heated sections one at a time. Road workers rotated through the sledge because my shoulders were still normal human shoulders. I held and directed while they delivered the heavy blows. Scale burst from the iron. Rain hissed against the forged stones. Every time someone became impatient, I heard Hesta in my head. Don't chase the shape, Cold. Don't make the outside pretty while the inside stays wrong. Don't let impatience choose the temperature. We scarf welded the central pieces into one broad yoke, reinforced the outside faces with salvaged anchor plate, and punched the 3 connection holes while the metal was still workable. For adjustment, I used the spare collars and forged tapered wedges that could alter individual rod tension without requiring entirely new threaded ends. When the yoke reached final shape, one worker moved toward the quench trough. No. We need it cool. We need it alive. We normalized it slowly. While it cooled, I replaced the overloaded rod's damaged collar with one having a longer bearing surface and cut a rusted pin from the slack rod's clevis. Sometime after midnight, Bren appeared with a bowl of stew and set it directly between my hands. Eat? The yoke is almost ready. You said that an hour ago. It was less ready then. The bridge will not become more repaired if its blacksmith passes out in the forge. Hesta? I asked. I have never met this woman, and yet I understand her completely. I ate. Iona sat nearby with maps across her knees. She had found an old survey note showing the east approach had been repacked after a flood 11 years earlier. The bearing shoe may have shifted back then, but the recent traffic surrounding Asterfall's Makers Fair had multiplied wagon loads enough to accelerate the damage. Asterfall broke a bridge from miles away, she said. Craft fairs have consequences. Bellhaven better be quiet. Both of them looked at me. Bren started laughing. Before dawn, we fitted the equalizer yoke. The jacks still supported part of the approach. We disconnected the 3 rods from their old individual brackets and seated them into the yoke with the collars loose. Then we tensioned them progressively. Too much on one rod would twist the frame the opposite direction. Too little would change nothing. Iona chalked alignment marks onto the deck while the supervisor checked the bearing gaps. I tapped each rod and listened as forge sight compared internal strain. The first adjustment brought the load distribution from 61-24-15 to 49-29-22. Better. We drove another wedge. 41-32-27. The bridge creaked overhead. Everyone stopped. I touched the yoke. Stress remained distributed. Again. A smaller adjustment. 36, 33, 31. There. We lowered the jacks slowly. The frame took its weight again. The bearing shoe was still crooked and still needed permanent repair, but the structure was no longer trying to tear itself sideways. I forged a smaller restraint plate for the old bracket location, this one designed only to maintain alignment, rather than pretend it could carry the entire lateral force. By sunrise, the storm had faded to mist. The river remained high. The bridge still stood. The supervisor wanted a load test. Empty wagon first. Bren volunteered his lead wagon. We unloaded it completely. You don't have to use yours. You repaired my wheel. If the bridge eats my wagon, I will consider us financially even. He drove slowly onto the approach. I kept one hand against the yoke housing. The load rose through the rods. 35, 33, 32. The yoke held. The wagon reached the first pier, then the second, then the opposite bank. We sent it back half-loaded. The yoke held. Then a grain wagon crossed at reduced weight. Only then did the supervisor remove the barrier. 2 workers remained at each end, limiting traffic to one loaded wagon at a time until the permanent bearing repair could be completed. Green Road came back to life. Grain rolled east, supplies rolled west. Families packed wet blankets. Livestock moved. Chickens complained with the confidence of creatures convinced they had personally reopened the bridge. I sat beside the forge and realized my hands were shaking from exhaustion. The supervisor approached with a coin box. Emergency craft rate and crossing bounty, 8 gold. I stared at him. After weeks of copper and silver, 8 gold sounded insane. That's too much. Bren physically put a hand over my mouth. He accepts. I removed it. I can speak. Not when money is involved? I pointed out that the road workers had done half the hammering. They were salaried. Iona had done measurements. She was contracted by the survey office. I had used bridge stock. It belonged to the bridge. Everyone systematically dismantled my excuses until I had no choice but to take the payment. I used part of it before we left to replace steel, charcoal, flux, oil, and several travel punches I'd worn badly during the repair. Bren watched with visible relief. There, you spent money on yourself. I spent it on tools. Baby steps. We stayed an extra day because the eastern road had become mud and because I could barely lift my arms. While I slept, the bridge crew began the permanent repair. When I woke, they had unloaded and removed the shifted bearing shoe. The stone beneath it showed exactly the wear forge site predicted. The supervisor asked if the old shoe needed replacing. It did not. You don't want to improve it? It worked for decades before the seat shifted. I assumed you'd change something. I change what's wrong. Somehow that answer traveled faster than the bridge repair itself. By the next station, one driver claimed I had forged an entirely new bridge overnight. Another claimed I had personally held the span up while the workers repaired it. Iona refused to correct either one. Bren started introducing me as the blacksmith who definitely did not hold up a bridge, which somehow made the rumors worse. The useful part was that people started bringing better problems. I fixed seed rake teeth that kept failing because the frame behind them twisted under load. I repaired the latch on a charcoal kiln whose air leak was ruining entire burns. A carpenter brought a box of bent nails recovered from a collapsed shed and asked whether any could be salvaged. We sorted them, discarded the deeply rusted ones, reheated and straightened the rest in batches, and in return he made me a narrow wooden case fitted exactly to my files and punches. Bren approved the arrangement because, according to him, I had finally discovered commerce with objects on both sides. True Forge site changed too, though there was no flash of light or announcement that I'd gained a level. After the bridge, I realized that if I touched one connected metal assembly and focused, I could follow force through adjacent pins, straps, springs, collars, and brackets without examining every component separately. Wood remained mostly blank. Leather told me almost nothing. Magic itself was still a wall, but metal mechanisms were beginning to read like sentences. The bridge had taught me to stop asking only, "What is broken?" and start asking, "Where is the force trying to go?" That difference saved a horse 2 days later when a freight wagon ahead of us began squealing down a long hill. I heard the sound change before the driver did. "Stop!" He waved us around. Then his left brake shoe shifted inward and its support touched the wheel tire. Sparks jumped. He stopped immediately. I put a hand against the linkage. Retaining bolt fractured, brake shoe rotating inward, continued descent, probable wheel lock, axle damage, loss of control. "Nobody moves this wagon." The driver looked toward the sky. "Another blacksmith." "Another?" Everyone on Green Road thinks the bridge man can smell broken iron now. I am the bridge man. His attitude changed quickly. The failed bracket gave me a chance to use the blueback spring iron I had studied earlier. Its elastic behavior was perfect for a retaining clip that needed to tolerate constant vibration without loosening. I heated it in the range I'd learned, shaped it, quenched it in oil, and flexed the finished clip with pliers. It sprang back. Forge site confirmed what experience now already told me. Material response known. Elastic recovery high. The driver stared at it. "What spell is that?" "Metallurgy." "What school?" "The annoying one." Iona laughed from the road. By then, I understood something about Bellhaven before I ever saw it. The town's reputation wasn't coming from one official proclamation or one famous noble. Its name simply kept appearing in ordinary conversation. A teamster mentioned buying a rainproof travel coat there. A healer asked whether Bren knew anyone carrying Bellhaven potions. A merchant complained that customers were suddenly asking for stronger packs after seeing work from that ridiculous tailor. One road worker wanted to know if the Bellhaven apothecary really had royal protection. Nobody agreed on all the details. Everybody agreed that something unusual was happening. The stories acted like gravity. Craftsmen heard them and wanted to see. Merchants heard them and wanted to profit. Customers heard them and wanted access. I had started Green Road thinking I was walking toward a town. Somewhere after the bridge, I realized I was walking toward a reputation. That made me more nervous than I wanted to admit. Reputation had a way of turning work into expectation. Broken things were easier. Broken things were honest about what they needed. Bren noticed before I said anything. Thinking of turning around? No. Good. Hesta would blame me. You've never met her. I fear her anyway. He guided the wagon around a rut. Bellhaven will try to buy you. A town can't buy people. You haven't met enough towns. I don't want a patron. Then don't take one. You say that like it's simple. For you? Very. I've watched you refuse money for weeks. I looked at him. He grinned. The hard part isn't deciding what you don't want. It's deciding what you do. I thought about that through the final stretch of Green Road. What did I want? Not a royal forge, not a line of adventurers waiting for legendary swords, not a title. I wanted a bench, a fire, enough tools to work properly, and a door ordinary people wouldn't be afraid to walk through. I wanted a farmer to be able to bring me a broken plow without apologizing for wasting my time. I wanted a cook to bring me a pot, a carpenter to bring me a chisel, a merchant to bring me a wagon part. I wanted to understand why things failed and make them useful again. That sounded small until I remembered a bridge full of wagons moving because 3 iron rods were finally sharing the work they had been designed to share. Small was not the same thing as unimportant. Broken was not the same thing as worthless. On the last morning of the journey, Green Road climbed one long wooded hill and widened near the top. Iona climbed down from the second wagon with her map case. Bren pulled the caravan onto the verge. I assumed something else had broken. What? I asked. Iona pointed east. The forest fell away below us into fields, orchards, and a shallow valley. In the middle of it spread a town of pale roofs, timber-framed upper stories, stone lower walls, narrow streets, chimney smoke, and wagon traffic thickening toward a dense central district. Sunlight flashed against something near the middle that might have been a fountain. Green Road descended toward the town in a long curve crowded with carts moving both directions. Bellhaven, Iona said. I stood beside the wagon and looked at the place I'd been hearing about since Asterfall. Somewhere down there was the tailor whose work had made a cheap cloak clasp fail because the fabric attached to it was too good. Somewhere down there was an apothecary producing ruby red medicine in clean glass bottles with silver stoppers. Somewhere down there were blacksmiths who already had customers, methods, reputations, and absolutely no reason to care about an earth fabricator carrying a cheap hammer. Good. I didn't want Bellhaven waiting for me. I wanted Bellhaven to have work. Bren came to stand beside me. Still interested? More than before. I know merchants near Market Square. I can introduce you. Eventually. You need somewhere to sleep? Eventually. You need somewhere to work. That one first. Iona folded her map. Try not to repair the entire town before dinner. I adjusted the strap across my shoulder. My new wooden tool case fit better than the old roll. Fresh steel and charcoal rode beneath Bren's wagon tarp. Most of the bridge money was still in my pouch. Hesta's iron token was tucked safely inside it. My earth hammer hung from my belt beside tools I had bought, repaired, and learned to use in this world. Behind us, Green Road stretched back through every broken tool, wheel, brake, well crank, hoe, bridge fitting, and roadside delay that had somehow become the journey itself. Ahead, Bellhaven waited without knowing my name. No promises, I said, and we started down the hill. Bellhaven looked less impressive the closer we got to it, which, I mean, as a compliment. From the hill, it had looked like the kind of fantasy town people wrote songs about. Up close, it was carts arguing over right-of-way, apprentices carrying too much at once, merchants shouting across stalls, dogs sleeping exactly where wheels wanted to go, children running through crowds with the confidence of creatures who had never considered mortality, and working people trying to get through another day without something expensive breaking. I liked it immediately. Green Road fed us into the western side of town and eventually widened into a market district built around pale gray cobblestones and a carved stone fountain. 2- and 3-story timber and stone shops crowded the square behind awnings, hand carts, produce stalls, barrels, baskets, stacked crates, and enough hanging signs to make me wonder how often somebody got hit by one during a storm. Bren's wagons slowed to walking speed. "Market Square," he said. "Try not to repair it." I wasn't planning to. A cart hit a rut beside us, and one wheel gave a noise I did not like. Bren pointed at me without turning around. "No." I kept walking. "I'm developing restraint." Iona climbed down near the fountain, because the local survey office was only a few streets away. Her mist moth cloak was rolled across the top of her pack now that the rain had cleared. "You have somewhere to go?" she asked. "Bren says he knows a blacksmith." That wasn't my question. I looked around at a town where I knew exactly 3 people, 2 of whom were leaving. "Then no." "Good. Means you're flexible." That is a very optimistic interpretation. She smiled and offered her hand. "I'll be on Green Road again after I file the bridge reports. If you haven't been expelled from Bellhaven by then, I'll find you." "Why would I be expelled?" Bren made a noise from the wagon. I ignored him. Iona shook my hand. "Thanks for the clasp." "Thanks for the road." She disappeared into the crowd carrying her maps, and I stayed beside Bren's lead wagon as we pushed farther around the square. That was when I started recognizing things I had never actually seen before. The first was an apothecary with a narrow wooden sign reading Mara's Remedies. Blue glass bottles filled part of the front window, and people moved steadily through the door beneath a little hanging bell. I only looked twice because the second time a woman came out carrying a wrapped packet of herbs and nearly walked into me. A little farther along stood the Bellhaven Alchemist Guild, a solid timber and stone building marked by a mortar surrounded by 3 green leaves. Several people in guild clothing were unloading reagent cases from a cart. "That's one of the places everyone's been talking about?" I asked. Bren followed my gaze. "Not exactly." He pointed across a branching street. The building there looked almost disappointingly ordinary. A narrow 2-story former shop with good front windows, shelving visible inside, and enough foot traffic to make the doorway busy. What was not ordinary was the board mounted beneath the apothecary sign. Even from across the street, I could see the royal seal. "Royally protected?" I asked. "Apparently." "An apothecary?" "Apparently." "Why?" "If you want the long version, ask someone who enjoys rumors." I watched a customer leave carrying a small padded case. Through the open doorway, I glimpsed clear potion bottles with smooth silver stoppers arranged behind the counter. Same bottles. As what? Iona's healing potion? Probably where she bought it. I considered crossing the street, then decided against it. I had come to Bellhaven to learn what people were making, but showing up at somebody's shop and demanding to know why the king liked their medicine seemed rude even by my standards. "There is definitely a story there," I said. Bren nodded. "Bellhaven has collected several." The next one appeared near the northern edge of Market Square. I didn't see the sign first. I saw a coat in the window. Gray-green fabric formed part of the outer shell, unmistakably similar to Iona's Mistmoth cloak. But everything attached to it made her repaired clasp suddenly look like what it was. An afterthought added to a sophisticated garment. Reinforcement followed the actual load paths. Metal fasteners were broad where stress collected and narrow where they only needed to guide fabric. Flexible sections remained free to move. Silver-gray material appeared at shoulders and seams in ways that suggested it stiffened only where force demanded it. I stopped walking. Bren's wagon continued without me for 6 paces before he noticed. "Found the tailor?" "I think so." "You've never met him?" "I don't need to." I stared at the coat another moment. Whoever had made it understood something I had learned on Green Road. Stronger everywhere was often worse than stronger where strength belonged. I almost went inside. Then the earth hammer at my belt bumped my leg and reminded me I still did not have a forge. "Later," I said. Bren looked amused. "You have said that about 3 different shops in 10 minutes. Bellhaven is distracting. That's what the merchants count on." Osric Fenn's smithy sat beyond the busiest part of Market Square, where the streets widened enough for wagons to turn without destroying storefronts. I heard the forge before I saw it. Not hammering, swearing. "That's promising," I said. Bren stopped his wagon in front of a broad stone and timber workshop whose double doors stood open to the street. Inside, a man with a heavy gray-streaked beard was kneeling beside a treadle-powered grinding wheel, while an apprentice held a broken pedal linkage in both hands. The man looked up when Bren entered. "If you're here about those wagon brackets, they're tomorrow. I brought you a problem instead." Osric looked at me. "I have apprentices?" "This one followed me from Asterfall." "Then return him." Bren smiled. "He's the reason my rear wagon arrived." Osric's eyes went to my tools. "Wheelwright?" "Blacksmith." "Wheel?" "Mostly iron problem pretending to be a wood problem." That got his attention. He stood. Osric was older than Hesta, but carried himself like somebody who still expected to outwork anyone foolish enough to challenge him. One shoulder sat slightly lower than the other from decades of hammering. "Rowan token?" he asked. I blinked. "How did you—" "Your pouch is open." I looked down. Hesta's iron token had worked its way partly out. I handed it to him. Osric turned it between blackened fingers. "Hesta Rowan let you leave with her mark?" She seemed relieved. "That sounds like Hesta. You know her?" "Everyone who buys Asterfall tool steel knows her." He handed the token back. "So why are you in Bellhaven?" "I need forge space. There are cheaper towns. I also need materials I don't understand. There are safer hobbies." Behind him, the apprentice tried fitting the broken pedal linkage together again. The fracture had gone through one arm of a small forked connector. Without thinking, I reached for it. Osric caught my wrist. "Ask." "Can I?" He let go. "Now you can." True Forge sight opened as soon as I touched the connector. Mild steel, repeated fatigue fracture, misalignment at treadle pivot. Root cause, left pivot bushing worn, forcing pedal linkage to twist with every stroke. Replacement connector alone, predicted failure within 5 weeks. I looked past it at the grinder. "Your pivot bushing is gone." The apprentice frowned. "The connector broke." "Because the pedal is twisting." Osric's face became very still. "How worn?" "Enough that I wouldn't repair this piece until you replace it." He crouched beside the treadle and moved the pivot by hand. The sideways play was obvious once you knew to look. Osric glanced at Bren. "You said wheel problem?" Bren spread his hands. "This is what he does." "How much do you want for the back forge?" I asked. Osric stood. "You haven't seen it." "Does it have an anvil?" "Yes." "Forge?" "Yes." "Roof?" "Mostly." "Good enough?" The back forge turned out to be a narrow annex attached to Osric's main workshop, originally built for a second journeyman who had moved away years earlier. The chimney drew properly, which mattered more to me than the missing roof tile. The anvil face was decent. The vise needed cleaning. The forge bed was shallow but usable. There were shelves, a scarred bench, a quench tank, and a separate side door opening toward the street. "8 silver a week," Osric said. "Coal separate. You damage my tools, you replace them. Your clients stay out of my work area. You don't undercut apprentices on new guild standard goods just because you can work faster." "I mostly repair." Osric's expression suggested I had admitted to collecting diseased birds. "Repairs." "Yes." "You traveled from Asterfall to one of the busiest trade towns in Varel so you could mend cracked cookware." "Not only cookware." "That does not improve the answer." Bren put a hand on my shoulder. "You'll like him." Osric looked doubtful. I paid the first week before Bren could intervene, which was perhaps the proudest moment of his journey. He stared at the coins in my hand. "I'm leaving before you ask for change." Bren's wagon still had deliveries to make farther east, so our goodbye happened in the least dramatic way possible. He told me which inns overcharged foreigners, which merchants paid late, and which streets flooded when it rained. I told him to grease his brake linkages. He told me I was no longer employed by his caravan and therefore had no authority over him. Then he gave me a small ledger. "For jobs?" "I have paper." "For money?" "Oh. Write down what materials cost. Write down what people pay. At the end of the week, if the second number is smaller than the first number, stop being an idiot." "That's surprisingly clear." "I made it for you." He climbed back onto the wagon. Bellhaven will try to make you important. Don't become expensive. Those aren't the same thing. Bren looked at me for a second. Good, you did learn something. Then he drove away. The first Bellhaven customer found me before I finished sweeping the annex. A fishmonger carried in a brass market scale whose beam kept sticking. Fen says repairs are through here now. I looked toward the wall separating my forge from Osric's. Did he? Said you'd either fix it or learn not to advertise. I examined the scale. The beam was straight. The pivot knife had developed a flattened edge from years of wear, and somebody had compensated by filing one balance slot deeper. That had created a false 0. Your scale is lying. The fishmonger looked alarmed. I don't cheat customers. I didn't say you did. Somebody tried to fix wear by changing the calibration. I forged a new hardened pivot knife, polished the bearing surface, restored the damaged adjustment slot, and recalibrated the beam against Osric's certified weights. The scale moved with almost no friction when I finished. How much? 3 silver. I paused, reached for Bren's ledger, and wrote down brass pin, steel, charcoal, time. 4. The fishmonger paid without argument. From the other side of the wall, Osric shouted, "Miracles happen!" Bellhaven gave me work faster than Asterfall had, not because anyone knew me, because a busy trade town produced a constant stream of small mechanical failures. A laundress brought the iron gears from a wringer whose teeth no longer meshed. A bookbinder needed the screw from a press rebuilt because the threads had stripped near maximum compression. A candlemaker brought molds with warped alignment pins. A brewer had a copper valve that leaked only when his kettle was hot. A cobbler's sole press had a bent toggle link. A butcher needed the threaded adjustment rebuilt on a meat slicer. A printer from 3 streets away brought the tension springs from a hand press and spent 10 minutes apologizing because the job was not real blacksmithing. I handed the springs back the next morning with corrected temper and told him anything that kept his hands working counted. The queue became visible from the street by the 4th day. Osric came into my annex during lunch and stared at the collection of objects waiting on shelves. You know swords exist. I've seen several. Armor. Also familiar? Adventurers pay. So do printers. Not as much. I opened Bren's ledger. For once, the second number was larger than the first. I'm doing fine. Osric leaned over the book. You charge a baker 4 silver and a merchant 9 for essentially the same work. The merchant's repair saved a shipment worth hundreds. That's pricing. Bren wore me down. And the baker? Her oven damper controls the only oven she has. So why 4? Because 9 would hurt her more than it helps me. Osric studied me. You're going to annoy people with money. They can afford the experience. He laughed despite himself. The adventurers came anyway. One carried a chipped sword made from excellent steel and asked for a new blade. Forge sight showed the chip was shallow, the temper sound, and the rest of the weapon barely worn. You don't need a new sword. The guildsmith said replacement. Why? The chip. That's not structural. Can you repair it? Yes. Then make it stronger. Why? He looked confused by the question. Because stronger is better. What are you fighting? Mostly ridgeback boars north of town. Then you need edge toughness more than hardness. If I make this as hard as possible, the next boar rib you hit may snap the blade instead of chipping it. I reprofiled the damaged section, corrected the edge geometry, and left the rest alone. He returned 3 days later because another member of his group had an axe, then a shield boss, then climbing spikes. Osric watched my queue slowly acquire weapons alongside pots, press screws, tools, and machinery. There, he said. Now you're becoming respectable. A woman is waiting outside with a broken sausage stuffer. I withdraw the compliment. Word spread. Some of it followed Green Road. A wagon driver walked into my forge and asked whether I was the man who rebuilt the East Bridge. I told him no. He said that was exactly what the bridge man would say. Another customer claimed I could determine how metal broke by tasting it. I stopped that rumor personally because people began arriving with dirty nails and expectations. True Forge Sight continued to improve through use, but never in the way rumors described. I still had to touch an object. I still had to focus. It still understood metal better than anything else. Bellhaven simply gave it more complicated metal to understand. Guild-made lock mechanisms, adjustable weaving frames, alchemical burners with silver-lined valves, a delicate brass pump used by a perfumer, tools made from alloys I had never seen on Earth. Every unknown material became a lesson. Every repair added something to the vocabulary in my head. I began buying small pieces of unusual scrap specifically to test them. Osric sold me damaged material cheaply on the condition that I stop using his good steel for experiments that produce puddles. One evening, I worked a thin strip of mana bronze through several temperatures until True Forge Sight finally stopped marking its magical response as unknown. Mana conductivity moderate, work hardening rapid, thermal cycling above threshold reduces conductivity permanently. That explained why a customer's alchemical burner valve had failed after somebody brazed it with too much heat. The ability could tell me that now because I had learned it, rather than because the world had decided I deserved an answer. That mattered to me. I did not want knowledge that skipped the work. About 2 weeks after I arrived, Iona reappeared in my doorway. "You have a sign now." I looked outside. A customer had hung a scrap board over the annex door after getting tired of explaining where the repair smith worked. Somebody had painted a hammer beside a cracked iron ring with a bright line joining the break. Under it were the words, "Repairs. Ask Eric." I didn't make that. I know. It's spelled correctly. Hesta would like you. "How is Bellhaven?" Iona asked. I looked toward Market Square. Distracting. Met the tailor? No. Apothecary? No. You've been here 2 weeks. I have work. She stared at the shelves behind me. Apparently. The funny thing was that I had begun encountering their work without meeting either person. A traveler brought in a metal buckle attached to a reinforced pack and mentioned that the tailor near Market Square had redesigned the straps after a previous one tore. A local healer brought a damaged locking case used to transport restricted medicines. When I repaired the latch, I saw the same clean, silver-stoppered bottles packed inside. The healer closed the case before I could ask questions and carried it toward the royally protected apothecary. Bellhaven's strange craftsmen existed around me mostly as consequences. Better clothes, better medicine. People traveling farther to buy both. I liked that more than fame. I knew what a good repair felt like when the person using it stopped thinking about it. Maybe good crafting worked the same way. The first serious offer arrived folded inside an expensive envelope. A merchant representative came to the forge wearing a coat too clean for the street and explained that his employer wanted exclusive access to my repair services for commercial wagons passing through Bellhaven. Retainer, 20 gold per month. Materials reimbursed, priority schedule guaranteed. Exclusive means I refuse other caravan work. Commercial transport repairs, yes. No. He blinked. You haven't heard the full terms. Does the full version change what exclusive means? No. Then no. You could triple what you're earning. And a farmer with a broken axle? There are other smiths. Then your employer can use them too. Osric found the rejection hilarious until a second offer came through one of the craft guilds, asking me to reserve 3 days each week for certified weapon and armor commissions. I declined that too. You know, Osric said, most craftsmen spend their careers trying to reach the point where important people compete for their time. I have important people competing for mine. I pointed at the next customer, an exhausted woman carrying the iron crank assembly from a bakery dough mixer. Osric looked at her, then back at me. You are using that word differently than everyone else. Maybe everyone else is wrong. The noble offer was harder only because of the number. The steward arrived with 2 guards and a drawing of a ceremonial longsword commissioned for an upcoming family investiture. The blade itself was not intended for combat. It needed layered steel, engraved channels, silver-gold inlay, a custom guard, and a level of finish that would take several uninterrupted days. Payment, 60 gold. I had enough money by then that 60 gold no longer sounded imaginary, but it still sounded like enough to buy my own forge instead of renting Osric's annex. When do you need it? I asked. 10 days. I looked at my queue. I can start in 4. His lordship expects priority. Then I'm not the smith he wants. The steward studied me as if deciding whether I was insulting him. You understand the commission is 60 gold? Yes. And you repair hand tools for silver. Also yes. Why? Because hand tools break. He stared another moment. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. 4 days. If you begin then and finish on schedule, we have an agreement. I accepted. Not because a noble wanted my work, because the sword was interesting. Decorative did not mean meaningless. Ceremonial objects carried memory, family, identity, and expectations just as surely as an old hoe carried someone's father. I spent that evening sketching the forging sequence and calculating how much stock to order. I never started it. At dawn 2 days later, every bakery around Market Square began buying flour at once. By mid-morning, prices jumped. By noon, people were arguing near the grain stalls. Osric heard the cause from a customer before I did. East Mill is down? How bad? Water wheel turns? Millstones don't. I looked up from a set of shears. Bellhaven's main grain mill sat beside the river beyond the eastern edge of town. Smaller mills existed around the region, but this one handled a huge share of the flour used by bakeries, inns, and market sellers inside Bellhaven itself. 1 day down was inconvenient. Several days meant shortages. A week meant merchants would begin hauling flour from other towns at whatever price the road allowed. They have millwrights. 3 of them. Then why is it still down? Osric shrugged. Because sometimes things break. That should have been enough to keep me at the forge. It was not. I finished the shears, told Osric where I was going, and reached the mill while workers were removing sacks of unground grain from storage. The building straddled a fast channel diverted from the river. A broad water wheel turned slowly outside because the sluice had been reopened for testing, but inside, the machinery answered with an ugly, repeating knock and almost no useful movement. The millmaster had disconnected the stones to stop further damage. 2 millwrights stood beside an opened floor section, arguing over a massive iron collar clamped around the main horizontal shaft. One side of the collar had cracked. Several wooden teeth on the first large gear were shattered. "Another smith?" one millwright asked when I introduced myself. "Good. Forge us a new collar." I crouched beside the broken one. Why did this one crack? Old metal. Maybe. I touched it. True forge sight opened. Forged iron collar. Structural integrity. 22%. Fatigue fracture. Repeated bending load. Previous reinforcement. 2. Root cause external. I followed the connected metal through the shaft fittings. The main water wheel axle ended in a forged iron gudgeon riding in a bearing block. The bearing sleeve was badly worn on its lower inside face. The shaft had dropped. Less than half an inch, but enough to change the gear alignment. The large driven gear had then started engaging high on one side of its teeth and low on the other. Wooden teeth began chipping. Somebody replaced individual teeth without correcting the alignment. More shock traveled back through the shaft. The collar started flexing. They reinforced it. That made the load travel into the keyway. The iron key holding the coupling had begun deforming too. I put one hand against the gudgeon housing and forced forge sight to show me the system instead of individual parts. Bearing wear severe. Shaft centerline displacement. Gear mesh asymmetric. Collar fracture, secondary. Coupling key deformation, progressive. Continued operation after collar replacement alone. High probability of shaft damage and catastrophic gear failure. "Don't make the collar yet," I said. The millwright frowned. "It is visibly broken." So was the bridge bracket. "What bridge?" "Long story." I pointed toward the bearing. "Your shaft dropped." They measured, then measured again. One millwright swore. The other crawled beneath the gear and inspected the wear marks I had already seen through the metal. "He's right." The millmaster looked at me. "How long? To do it properly?" "Yes." I hated that question because the correct answer depended on what we found after taking everything apart. If the shaft itself is sound, a day. Maybe 2. We were told a new collar could have us running by evening. It could. Then you'll break something more expensive. The millmaster rubbed both hands over his face. Flour prices are already moving. Then let's stop talking. Repairing a mill was nothing like repairing a wagon beside Green Road. The metal mattered, but so did wood, water, stone, and machinery I had never built before. That was why I liked the millwrights almost immediately. Once they realized I was not pretending True Forge Sight made me an expert in everything, the argument ended. They understood wooden gears better than I did. They knew how the millstone gearing transferred speed vertically, how individual hardwood cogs were seated, which timbers could be jacked safely, and how much movement the water wheel axle could tolerate before the outside bearing began binding. I understood the metal interfaces that were failing between those systems. We shut the sluice completely and locked the water wheel. Workers removed floor panels. We disconnected the damaged coupling, marked every part, and built heavy cribbing beneath the main shaft. Then we lifted it only enough to unload the bearing. The old sleeve came out in pieces. One side was thin enough to bend between my fingers. How old? I asked. The millmaster thought. 26 years. Scheduled replacement? There was one. When? 6 years ago. Every craftsman in the room looked at him. Paperwork, he said weakly. I understood immediately why Hesta hated management despite not knowing what management meant in this world. Once the shaft was supported properly, the real damage became visible. The forged iron gudgeon at the end of the wooden axle had worn slightly oval but remained serviceable. The shaft itself was sound. The coupling key needed replacing. The cracked collar was salvageable, only as scrap. 14 wooden gear teeth needed replacement rather than the 5 visibly broken ones because the others had developed crushing damage from misaligned engagement. That part belonged to the millwrights. While they selected seasoned hardwood and began shaping new cogs, I turned the mill's repair forge into my workspace. We needed a new bearing sleeve, new coupling key, new collar, and one smaller retaining ring that had stretched under the repeated shock. Bellhaven did not have one piece of iron large enough for the collar ready to use. We did have 2 structural bars and part of an old mill spindle stored as scrap. True Forge Sight told me the spindle material was cleaner. I cut it, opened it, and forged it into a heavy strip while another smith worked the sledge. We bent the hot strip around a mandrel matching the shaft coupling, scarfed the ends, brought the joint back to welding heat, fluxed it, and closed the ring beneath repeated blows. The first weld looked good outside. Forge Sight showed a narrow, incomplete bond near the inside edge. Again. The second smith looked exhausted. It closed. Outside. We can dress the seam. The seam isn't the problem. We reheated it. Second welding heat. Lighter first blows, then heavier. I watched the internal line shrink until Forge Sight finally showed continuous material. We normalized the collar rather than quenching it. I wanted toughness, not brittle hardness. While it cooled, I turned to the bearing sleeve. Bronze would normally have been obvious, but Bellhaven's mill stores contained a copper tin alloy with a small amount of mana-reactive metal mixed through it. True Forge Sight recognized the composition from my experiments but flagged one danger immediately. Too much heat would reduce the metal's ability to distribute the faint, magical vibration produced by the millstones. I had no idea why millstones produced magical vibration. The millwright gave me a look that said this was a stupid question. Grain stone, he said. Local stone holds a little field mana. Keeps flour cooler during grinding. Of course it does. You don't have that where you're from? Our flour was aggressively non-magical. I cast the sleeve slightly oversized, then machined and scraped the inside surface by hand until it matched the gudgeon closely without binding. True Forge Sight kept trying to give me microscopic contact patterns. I forced myself to check with pigment and feel as well. A power that told me the answer was useful. Knowing how to verify it was safer. By evening, the new collar had cooled enough to finish. We drilled the bolt holes, fitted the clamping faces, forged a new key from tougher medium carbon steel, and made the retaining ring. The millwrights had replaced the damaged wooden gear teeth but refused to final shape their contact faces until the shaft returned to its correct center line. Smart. Everything depended on alignment. That was when the noble steward arrived. I had forgotten about him entirely. He stood in the mill doorway staring at me covered in soot beside a collar large enough to wear as a belt if I were a giant. Master Eric, not a master. The sword. My stomach dropped. I was supposed to start tomorrow. His lordship's materials arrived tonight. I came to confirm the schedule. I looked around. The mill was still apart. I can't start tomorrow. His expression cooled. We had an agreement. I know. The investiture date cannot move. Behind him, workers carried empty flour sacks past the doorway. Then you'll need another smith. The steward looked from me to the mill. You are surrendering a 60 gold commission for this? For the mill. This mill has smiths, and I'm one of them right now. His lordship specifically requested your work. I'm sorry. I meant it. I would have enjoyed making that sword. But your sword can wait. Their bread can't. The entire forge went quiet because apparently everyone nearby had chosen that exact moment to stop hammering. The steward looked at me for a long time. I expected anger. Instead, he glanced toward the stacked grain waiting to be milled. You understand I cannot promise the commission remains open. I know. And you understand 60 gold is a great deal of money. Bren would be furious with me. Who? Never mind. The steward nodded once, then finished the mill. He left. One millwright stared at me. 60 gold? Please don't. You repair cookware for silver. Apparently, everyone in Bellhaven knows this. 60 gold. Put the gear back together. We worked through the night. Once the new bearing sleeve was seated, we lowered the shaft gradually and checked alignment against marks taken from unworn portions of the gear frame. The first position was too high. The new sleeve needed another fraction scraped from its lower face. We lifted again, removed it, corrected it, reseated it. Better. The water wheel axle now ran almost exactly through its intended center line. We installed the new collar and key, tightening the clamp bolts in alternating order so the coupling did not pull sideways. The millwrights fitted the replacement wooden teeth one at a time, leaving each slightly proud before rotating the gear by hand and marking the contact. Shave, rotate, mark. Shave is, again. I had expected Forge Sight to make this tedious. Instead, it made the tedium fascinating. Every adjustment changed where force traveled. A gear tooth that was a hair too tall stole load from its neighbors. A collar tightened unevenly, pulled the shaft enough to alter contact on the opposite side. Nothing worked alone. Machines were agreements between parts. By the time the sky outside began turning pale, we were ready for the first-hand rotation. 6 workers leaned into the great wheel. The gears moved. One knock. I raised my hand. We traced it to a replacement cog contacting too early. The millwright corrected it. Again. The wheel turned through a full revolution. Then 2. Then 5. No knock. We disengaged the millstones and opened the sluice barely enough to move the water wheel under its own power. Slow rotation. I kept one hand against the bearing housing. Load stable. Temperature rising normally. Collar stress even. Gear engagement balanced. More water. The wheel accelerated. The new wooden teeth settled into rhythm. No vibration spike. We engaged the first stone pair without grain. The machinery deepened into a steady, layered rumble. The shaft held. Grain, the millmaster said. One sack went into the hopper. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then flour began falling from the chute in a pale stream. Nobody cheered yet. Craftsmen are suspicious of early success. We ran the first stone for 10 minutes. Then 20. Bearing temperature stayed safe. We engaged the second set. More grain, more flour. The great mill settled into a rhythm that felt entirely different from the broken pounding I had heard the day before. The sound was smoother because every part was finally agreeing with the others again. The millmaster picked up a handful of fresh flour and just stood there looking at it. That's it? One exhausted worker asked. No, I said. Everyone groaned. You replace that bearing sleeve on schedule next time. The millmaster threw a flour sack at me. By sunrise, word had reached Market Square. I knew because bakers began arriving before I left the mill, asking whether production had really resumed. By the time I walked back through Bellhaven, exhausted enough to mistake a fountain for a chair, flour prices were already moving downward. The strange part was what people celebrated. Nobody cared about the collar. Nobody cared about the bearing sleeve. Nobody wanted to hear how we realigned the shaft or redistributed gear contact. They cared that the bakeries had flour again. I had spent most of my life thinking craftsmen were judged by the objects they made. Green Road and Bellhaven were teaching me something else. Sometimes the best proof of a repair was everything that happened afterward. Bread cooled in windows, wagons reached markets, wells turned, bridges carried people home. The object disappeared back into ordinary life, and that was the success. Osric was waiting in my annex when I returned. "You're late. I was gone one day. Your customers reproduced." The shelves were full. On the workbench sat a sealed envelope. "The noble?" "Yes." I sighed and opened it. The message was brief. The ceremonial sword commission had been moved to another smith because the date could not change. Underneath that was a second line. When the investiture was complete, his lordship wished to commission a set of agricultural tools for 3 tenant farms on his estate, with no deadline beyond when the blacksmith considers the important work finished. I read it twice. Osric looked over my shoulder. "You annoyed a noble into understanding you." "Is that good?" "Extremely rare." There was no 60 gold. I didn't care nearly as much as Bren would have wanted me to. The mill repair paid well anyway. More importantly, it changed the kind of work people brought me. Not grander, larger. A brewery asked me to inspect the drive mechanism of its grain crusher before harvest. The town bathhouse wanted an old lift pump examined before replacing it. A warehouse owner asked whether I could redesign the latching system on loading doors that kept warping in wet weather. I began taking inspection jobs where the correct answer was sometimes do nothing. That surprised people more than any complicated repair. One merchant showed me a support beam bracket and asked me to reinforce it. Forge Sight showed the bracket was deliberately softer than the bolts, so it would bend first if the loading platform shifted. No. Why? Because this is supposed to fail before the wall does. You are refusing to make it stronger? Yes. What kind of blacksmith refuses strength? One who likes walls. Osric heard about it and laughed for an entire afternoon. A month after arriving, I stopped renting the annex. Not because Osric asked me to leave, he did the opposite. "Buy the place." "Your annex?" "No, across the lane." A former farrier's workshop had been empty since winter. Small forge, stable chimney, good stone floor, tiny upstairs room, storage lean-to. Front work area big enough for 3 benches if I was willing to stop collecting scrap like a crow. "I can't afford that." Osric named the price. I checked Bren's ledger. I could. Barely. Green Road's bridge money, Bellhaven repairs, the mill payment, and weeks of actually charging people something resembling sensible rates had accumulated when I wasn't paying attention. That feels irresponsible. Buying your workplace? Spending almost everything. You spent almost everything you owned getting to Bellhaven. That was different. Because you had less? I hated when older smiths used logic. I bought the workshop. I kept the sign someone had made for the annex and hung it above the new door. Repairs. Ask Eric. Osric said it was the worst forge name in Varel. I told him it wasn't a name. He said that was why it was the worst forge name in Varel. Customers loved it. Bren returned 3 weeks later and stood in the doorway looking around at the place. "You bought property." "Apparently." "You wrote things in the ledger." "Regularly." "You charged fair rates." "Usually." He became emotional enough that I almost worried about him. Then he inspected his own brake linkage without being asked, and I decided miracles were real. Iona came through later that evening carrying new road maps. We ate outside the forge while Market Square quieted beyond the lane. "So this is permanent?" she asked. I looked through the open door. My tools had places now. Hesta's Rowan token hung from a nail beside the bench. The portable Green Road bellows sat on a shelf, still stained with mud from the bridge. Blueback spring iron scraps were sorted beside Bellhaven mana bronze. My earth hammer rested on the main bench instead of my belt for the first time since Asterfall. "I think so." "You haven't met the tailor." "No." Or the apothecary? No. Bren stared at me. You live 3 streets away. They seem busy. So are you. Exactly. Iona smiled. Maybe that's why Bellhaven works. I thought about the shops I had passed on my first day. The gray-green coat in the tailor's window. Blue bottles at Mara's Remedies. The royal seal beneath an apothecary sign. People did not need to know one another personally for their work to affect the same town. The tailor made travelers better equipped for roads. The apothecary kept people alive long enough to keep traveling them. I repaired what broke underneath them. That did not feel like a guild. It barely felt like a pattern, but patterns were often easier to see from outside. My last customer that night arrived after Bren and Iona had left for their inn. I was preparing to close when a boy stood in the doorway holding something behind his back. Are you Eric? Depends who's asking. His eyes widened. I'm Eric. My sister said you fix anything. Your sister has been exposed to advertising. He slowly brought out a small toy cart. 4 wooden wheels, a carved horse at the front, and a tiny metal steering linkage running beneath the body. One wheel hung sideways because the little iron pin holding its axle had snapped. My grandfather made it, he said. Mum says it's old. Old isn't a problem. I don't have money. I looked toward Bren's ledger on the bench. I could almost hear him. Do you know how to sweep? The boy nodded. Then sweep the front step while I look at this. He worked with the seriousness of a guild apprentice while I clamped the tiny, broken pin beneath a lamp. True Forge site activated exactly as it had for the public forge in Asterfall, the Green Road Bridge, and Bellhaven's grain mill. Material, low-carbon iron. Fatigue fracture, wear at axle hole. Repair viable. The scale of the problem did not matter to the ability. I liked that. I made a new pin from a scrap no longer than my little finger, polished the axle hole, fitted a tiny bronze sleeve so the wood would not wear as quickly, and reassembled the cart. The boy rolled it across the bench, all 4 wheels tracked straight. How much? He asked. How's the step? He looked outside. Half the dust had merely been relocated into one large pile. Bad. Then we're even. He grinned and ran home with the toy. I closed the door, banked the forge, and stood for a while in the quiet workshop. Asterfall's summoning ritual had tried to call a legendary instrument capable of restoring what its craftsman could not repair. It had gotten a man holding a $38 hammer. I still didn't know whether that had been a mistake. I was starting to think the ritual had understood the request better than we had. I had repaired a forge system, tools people inherited from their parents, wagons, wells, brakes, a bridge, market equipment, and a grain mill. None of them had turned into legendary artifacts. Most would never have songs written about them. Good. A repaired plow belonged in a field. A repaired scale belonged on a market counter. A repaired mill belonged beside a river making flour. Maybe masterwork did not mean expensive. Maybe it meant the person using something could trust it enough to stop thinking about it. I was about to climb upstairs when something slid beneath the front door. Not a letter. A narrow wooden case. I reopened the door. The lane was empty. Inside the case lay a broken object unlike anything I had repaired so far. A slender brass tuning fork mounted into a dark wooden grip, one tine fractured cleanly near its base, with hair-thin silver lines embedded through the metal in patterns too deliberate to be decoration. I touched it. True Forge site appeared, hesitated, and then returned more blanks than answers. Material: enchanted brass composite. Structural integrity, 46%. Physical fracture, repairable. Embedded magical lattice, active. Enchantment function, unknown. Harmonic response, unknown. Improper heat application will destroy embedded lattice. Recommended repair method. Incomplete. Additional specialist knowledge required. I stared at the words. For the first time in weeks, I had absolutely no idea how to fix something. A folded piece of paper sat beneath the tuning fork. There was no name. Only one sentence. A tailor who understands impossible materials, an apothecary who makes impossible medicine, and now a blacksmith who repairs what everyone else discards should probably stop pretending Bellhaven isn't becoming something unusual. I read it again. Then I turned the paper over. On the back was a smaller line. If you want to know why the fork broke, bring your hammer tomorrow at noon. I looked at the strange instrument. at the incomplete information hovering above it, and felt the same excitement I had when Frost Iron first refused to explain itself in Asterfall. Somewhere outside, Bellhaven's market bells marked the hour. I smiled, set the broken tuning fork carefully beside my $38 hammer, and decided tomorrow's queue could start a little late.